Thank you very much. And my question goes to Andrés Rozental. First of all, I can assure you, Andrés, that in terms of useless mushrooming, my region is as good as yours. We have Commonwealth of Independent States, we have Eurasian Community, we have Black Sea Initiative, we have European Partnership, you name it. So please, I'm with all modesty, we're behind you or a little bit ahead of you. But my question is about the correlation between what Mr. Stevens was describing and you were describing. For example, Pacific Alliance, vis-a-vis Bolivarian alliances which are being built, does that come hand in hand with the security arrangements in future? Not at the moment, I understand. But does it go hand in hand? Will there be a nucleus of security systems based on different ideological commonness? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson over there, please.
Well, I wanted to amplify a little bit on what Philip Stevens said about the importance of fiscal policy. We're seeing the strange thing that the cost of health care is now becoming a vital piece of geopolitics, because it's the growing cost of health care in all of the developed world that is having significant fiscal effects. In the U.S., that's the combination of that with the political polarization that has led us to the sequester, which is unlikely to go away unless something happens to deal with the long-term issue of federal debt. And debt is projected now to grow to about 200% of GDP by 2050 if nothing is done. And that's largely driven by health care, baby boomers aging, and the increasing cost of medicine. Or medical care, not just medicine. So the two parties now focus only on so-called discretionary spending, and that's where the U.S. gets the wherewithal to act on the global stage. So the long-term issue here, strangely enough, is that we didn't hear anybody actually mention it, but Philip raised it in the fiscal issue, is this matter of health care.
Thank you. Christopher Jackson.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank the delegates firstly for their comments. I guess I wanted to ask a question. I know we're touching on energy security later in the afternoon, but one generally about what the sort of impact of sort of renewable energy and sort of the newer developments in battery technology will have on sort of geoeconomic changes. So I guess my question to the group is, in terms of like electricity generation and power in the future, where this is obviously a key element of development, where do you see the main sort of drivers being? Where do you see the main challenges for a lot of these developing nations in being able to develop those capabilities they need to be able to develop and pursue a leading role in the global economy as it stands?
John Chipman.
My question is on the Pacific Alliance. I remember when President Santos was in London about 18 months ago and gave a big address at Mansion House. He once referred to Colombia as a South American country, once referred to Colombia as a Latin American country, but 4 times referred to Colombia as a Pacific country, almost as if he wanted, by mentioning the word Pacific, to drink in the elixir of the Asia-Pacific economic success and borrow from it. And clearly the Pacific Alliance has grown in the last 18 months. There's now talk of MILA, and effectively a common stock market. So if an IPO is done in Mexico, Peruvians, Chileans, and Colombians could buy into it. And everybody recalls, at least the 4 members of the Pacific Alliance, that the GDP of the 4 countries of the Pacific Alliance is about 10% bigger than is Brazil's, which implies a sort of geoeconomic and geopolitical challenge also to Brazil's hegemonic dominance of the economy of South America. My 3 short questions about the Pacific Alliance is, 1, what is the domestic support in the 4 principal countries of the Pacific Alliance for this new Pacific identity? And will the entrenchment of the Pacific Alliance finally put to bed the memory of the Pacific Wars, especially as between Chile and Peru? Second, do you see the Pacific Alliance really leading to increased trans-Pacific trade as between the 4 core countries and the big giants of the Asia-Pacific economies? And third, what risk do you see that the Pacific Alliance will fall into the trap of all international organizations of this kind and expand too quickly? People speak of Costa Rica joining soon, Panama, and I even heard from Felipe Larraín, the finance minister of Chile, that Uruguay, despite being an Atlantic country, is now wanting to join the Pacific Alliance. Clearly, if it expands at that rate, it won't deliver on the promises that President Santos first gave us in London 18 months ago.
Thank you very much. There was somebody over there whose name began with an F, but my eyesight is too poor to see whether it was Dr. Fierdo or Professor Flores.
Yes, Flores, yeah.
Thank you.
I have a question to Dr. Baru and to Ambassador Rozental, which exactly has to do with this regionalism. I wonder whether we are not thinking in old terms about all these alliances and taking regionalism as a harmful movement. And my point is that we have side evolutions which haven't been taken into account. First of all, the segmented idea of the oceans. The Panama Canal is being enlarged and will have a tremendous impact in how we think about Pacific and Atlantic. It's going to open up in 2014. In Asia, thanks to the efforts of the Indonesian government, the Strait of Sunda will, in the near future, become an alternative to the Strait of Malacca. And we know also that the Arctic, until the end of this decade, will be navigable. So this will change a lot, how we look at the oceans, and will change the dynamics between different regions in every ocean in the world. Secondly, are changes in the way of producing goods. Beyond fragmentation, we are going to have the introduction of the 3D printers. We now can store designs and projects in the clouds, and we have a new generation of robots and exoskeletons, which are going to change dramatically production processes. And thirdly, even the regional integrations have their own dynamics. So, for instance, taking South America, nobody wants the abolition of Mercosur. On the contrary, they want the evolution of Mercosur, and one of the likely evolutions of Mercosur is going to be a merger with the Andean community. And with this, we are going to have an integration which will be in both parts of the oceans of the continent, the Atlantic and the Pacific. So my question is, shouldn't we move on in our thoughts and have a more modern way of looking at all these integrations and at the segmentation of the oceans? In the future, probably, we'll have multiple memberships in weaker integrations, as perhaps is going to take place also in Europe.
Thank you very much. We'll take 4 more interventions before we have to return to the panel order to keep to reasonable time. Braz Barakui from Brazil.
Thank you, Adam. A question to Ambassador Rozental. I notice one word absent from your geoeconomic overview of Latin America, and that's China. How do you see the evolving geoeconomic relations between Mexico and China? Because there have been several high-level meetings and the initiatives of recent. Most recently, the meetings between Presidents Xi Jinping and Peña Nieto in St. Petersburg, where several investments have been announced. And how does it affect Mexico's more traditional relations with the US? Thank you.
Thank you. Jean-Louis Gégorat?
Yes, I would like to come back to this very important issue raised by Dr. Barrow of demographic factors. And I have a simple question to the three speakers. There is a huge asymmetry in a common situation between Europe and America. In America, in the US, there is a huge immigration flow coming from Latin America, but with in spite of resistance, a remarkable capability of the US to assimilate these newcomers. In Europe, there is already, and will be more and more, a considerable flow coming from North Africa and even Black Africa, and with a less and less capability to assimilate. Don't you think this asymmetry may be a major political and strategic factor?
Thank you very much. And Mr. Schmidt, I think, was keen to get in.
Yeah, thank you. I wonder if the main challenge is not really geo-economy, but more geo-finance, because it's not exactly the same idea. And I just give two examples of geo-finance just recently. One is the sovereign debt. We don't speak about the sovereign debt. The problem is not finished. And the second example is perhaps the monetary wars with impact on Japan, India, Brazil, BRICS in general. And the confusion between economics and finance is something which is wrong. There are connections between both, but sometimes, from the viewpoint of the nation, it's really a new challenge, the challenge of finance, more perhaps than the challenge of economics in itself.
Thank you. And finally, Yoichi Kato, please, with apologies to everybody else.
Thank you, Adam. I think all through the morning sessions, what the questions we are looking at is whether we are seeing the end of liberal internationalism as a tool to manage the conflict or national security order. And in that sense, the three panelists' presentations were very interesting. And its geo-economic factors as an impediment are extensively discussed. But my question is, the liberal interventionism is not just based on economic interests, but also the values, democracy promotion and human rights. And so my question to Mr. Stevens is that, is this the trend of decline of liberal internationalism, if it's not the total disappearance? Is this a longer-term irreversible trend, or is this just a temporarily reversible tendency that we are seeing? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I think everybody can tell that the range of, from the range of the questions, that part of the problems of this subject is that it's all-encompassing. And so I think the methodological approach set up by Sanjaya of defining 5 or 6 key points of focus, centers of gravity, is analytically possibly the only way in which one can begin to approach this in a systematic way. But let me encourage all of the panelists to pick up those questions that they were particularly wanted to intervene on, rather than to adopt an exhaustive approach. We'll go in the same order. Sanjaya, why don't you start again?
All right. Thanks, Adam. 3 points which I will respond to. One, on energy. I bring in energy into resources as a whole because it's no longer just energy. We are looking at competition for land, for food, minerals, and biodiversity. So it's the logic that defines the search for energy resources is the same logic that defines search for other resources, and that is a defining element of a lot of geopolitical conflict. It's been for a long, long time. So I think this is a central concern of any geoeconomic analysis, how nation states deploy political resources and financial resources in search of natural resources. On the second question of regionalism, which Mr. Flores asked, in fact, it's a very interesting example of how geoeconomics is defining geopolitics. Because for a long time, we spoke about the Asia-Pacific as a region. The Asia-Pacific was a region defined by economic and political principles. Suddenly, we had Hillary Clinton coming to India a couple of years back and talking about the Indo-Pacific. Now, why is it that the United States shifts from talking about the Asia-Pacific to the Indo-Pacific? because there is a new redefinition of the region, bringing India in to Asia, which has been necessitated both by economics and politics. I would argue more economics than politics. And therefore, these are constantly changing definitions. What is the Asia-Pacific region? What is the Indo-Pacific region? It's a problem that the East Asian process, community building process, has been dealing with for the last 5-6 years. Who is in and who is out? So I guess every other region would also face the same problem. But the point I was making about regionalism is that in the sphere of trade, I think that we have a major challenge. And there's no point running away from it. We looked at regionalism, as I said, as the building blocks of multilateralism in the sphere of trade. We have come to a point today where regionalism is challenging multilateralism. And the entire WTO system is being brought into question. I think it's a major challenge for the WTO, and how the WTO handles this remains to be seen. Finally, Mr. Schmidt, geofinance. I actually began by saying that more heads of government around the world care about what Ben Bernanke does than Chuck Hagel or John Kerry do, right? I mean, that's the world we are in. And that is because of the fact is that what happens with money flows is central to the fortunes of nations as we've seen them, particularly in the recent past. But having said that, I think the point I'd like to make is that fiscal policy is at the end of the day defined by nation states. And even monetary regimes are defined by nation states. Central banks, even in the highly integrated region like Europe, try to retain autonomy of action. You still have the Bank of England, you have the Deutsche Bank, you have different central banks trying to retain their autonomy of action. So there is, despite globalization and fiscal integration, it's the nation state that still retains control over both fiscal and monetary policy within the limits imposed by global integration.
I'll pick up on a few of the questions relating to the Pacific Alliance primarily. To Igor, there is a component of security in the alliance. It so far has fundamentally versed on drug trafficking and organized crime, which is something that affects all four of us. And I assume that as the alliance progresses, there might be other issues that would join the agenda. John, domestic support for the Pacific Alliance, I can probably only talk about Mexico because I don't know the situation in the other countries. It is probably at this point in time being given the highest priority on the part of the government in terms of the various negotiations and different geo-economic and geopolitical alliances that Mexico has. I think even more than TPP, because we don't quite see where TPP is going and when and if TPP will become a reality. But the Pacific Alliance is a reality, and I think that the danger of overextending and growing too quickly, yes, I agree with you. I'm hopeful that all of these other, I mean, Canada is an observer, the Europeans are there, everybody's there, everybody thinks that this is the new kid on the block, and everybody wants to be part of it. I think that the best thing it can do is probably mature slowly, and not go into an overextension. The issue of the China-Mexico relationship, Braz, is a very interesting one. Mexico is the only country that borders on the Pacific Ocean that does not have a large Chinese presence, whether Chinese community or Chinese economic presence. This is partly due to the fact that we have historical baggage with China. The Chinese presence in Mexico dates from the turn of the 19th century, We didn't do very well with the Chinese in Mexico. We interned them at the behest of the United States. We basically didn't treat them very well. And as a result, China and Mexico have had a very accidental relationship over the years. When the Chinese premier first started coming to Latin America some years ago, asking countries to recognize China as a market economy, the only country that refused to do so was Mexico. And not only that, but we also stopped them from entering the WTO. We were the last holdout for the consensus and the unanimity to get China into the WTO, partly because we already had some rather unpleasant experiences with China's not playing by the rules in terms of global trade. That has now changed very dramatically. As you mentioned, not only in St. Petersburg, but also with a couple of other meetings that have taken place with the new Chinese and Mexican governments. I will probably predict that Mexico and China are going to have a much closer relationship as we go forward. But it's a different relationship from the one that China has with many of the Latin American economies. It's not a resource-based relationship. It's hopefully going to be a more mature type of a relationship, and we'll see how that develops. And finally, on the immigration question, which is, I think, a very interesting question, yes, I agree with you. I think that the major difference between the US and Europe on the immigration issue is the inability of Europe and the growing inability of Europe to deal with assimilating its immigrant populations, while as so far, the United States, in spite of not having been able to get comprehensive immigration reform through Congress, is and has been historically a much better example of assimilation of immigration. And immigration is part and parcel of geopolitical and geoeconomics. So I think it's a very important point that we made.
Thank you. Philip.
Just very briefly, a couple of things. Just to the point that we need to break out of our traditional views of different regions, I agree very much. And I think China's ultimately successful campaign to win observer status on the Arctic Council tells you how much the world is changing because of, as was said, the way we look at the oceans has to change. On the question of healthcare, as we spend more money to keep ourselves healthier, are we risking our security in the process? I think healthcare itself is particularly acute in the US. I always sort of marvel at the thought that although the US has a privatized healthcare system, it spends more on state-funded healthcare than does the United Kingdom with a state healthcare system. But the more general point that welfare or entitlement spending is growing and taking a bigger and bigger share of the budgets of all Western economies, and that's going to accelerate, is a very important one. And I don't think it's one that any of these countries has yet properly addressed. Finally, on liberal interventionism, I don't think we're going to give up our values. And I think in the long term, the universal rather than Western values of freedom and dignity and respect, and in a way, democracy in its broadest sense. I mean, I'm a real believer that the world is heading in this direction. I think what's changed is we no longer have the confidence and in our ability to, if you like, sell those ideas, either as one US administration tried to do at the on the tip of a cruise missile, or indeed more generally. So I think we're going to go through a period where realpolitik and a more Westphalian view of the international system will prevail.
Thank you very much. Well, this morning we've addressed three large overarching themes. After lunch, from 3 p.m., we'll be doing some deep dives in 2 sequential sittings of 12 special sessions, and I hope that we'll re-emerge from those better equipped to answer the exam question which has been set for tonight, who manages international security? But in the meantime, please join me in thanking the panelists for their contribution.